We were more or less held hostage for 4 hours, and then the Border Patrol showed up and arrested them.
So the cartels do have an influence and impact, I'm sure, on law enforcement over there, because over there, if you don't cooperate, you don't exist.
Over the course of 6 days, I traveled to 5 different hotspots along the border, and I had the opportunity to get an in-depth look at the issues that you won't hear about from many of the major news outlets. In some cases, residents that I tried to talk to refused to talk to anyone in the media because they've had their words twisted so many times in the past. It was disheartening to see the aversion that some have to journalists of any type, but I can't say that I blame them. I just hope that this documentary offers people some hope that honesty in the media isn't dead. You just have to look for it in the right places. That's why I've combined research with personal insight to offer the most cohesive and comprehensive view of what the true issues seem to be and how everything can begin moving in a more positive direction. It's not enough to simply have a heart for people. That's easy. You have to have a mind that will help them, and that's where the true challenge lies. Laredo is a border town in southern Texas. It had razor wire installed in mid-November 2018, but it's since been taken down, leaving no man-made barriers. Now, Laredo is a notorious hotspot for smuggling due to its proximity to the cartels. However, the violent crime in Laredo is low compared to what you might expect. And that seems to be the case across several other border towns such as McAllen, Texas and Nogales, Arizona. But they're by no means free from the ramifications of being on the border. The first morning I woke up in Laredo, I went for a walk in a nearby park along the Rio Grande. In the early morning, you see all these fishermen come down to the edge of the Rio Grande, and while I'm sure that some were fishermen, it's also reported that the Los Zetas will plant scouts along the border disguised as fishermen. The bloodiest and most cruel cartel in all of Mexico is known as the Los Zetas cartel. With practices similar to terrorist groups in the Middle East, they brought brutality to the next level, specifically in their intimidation tactics and the illicit trade of smuggling people into the US. In fact, those who try to cross without the cartel's help are liable to being kidnapped and held for ransom. Those whose families can't pay often wind up in a mass grave. The Los Zetas participate in illegal immigration, sex trafficking, gun smuggling, oil siphoning, assassinations, extortion, kidnapping, and narcotics smuggling, which includes fentanyl, cocaine, heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamines. The Los Zetas span from the Laredo sector to the southern tip of the Big Bend, and their origin goes back to the 1990s and early 2000s when members of Mexico's special forces deserted their ranks and became an enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel. However, it wasn't until 2010 that the Los Zetas cartel officially broke away and became a rival of the Gulf Cartel that they were previously a part of. By 2011, they were the largest cartel by area, surpassing the Sinaloa cartel. For the next 2 years, they'd have complete government control over much of Coahuila, and they used that opportunity to systematically exterminate masses of innocent people in ovens and oil drums. Their atrocities remain largely unreported because they controlled everything from the governor to the city jails to the media. The Los Zetas became their most brutal under the reign of Miguel Angel Trevino Morales, starting in the late 2000s. He encouraged gladiatorial fighting, killing experiments with various instruments, and a former hitman had said that Morales couldn't sleep unless he killed someone. Morales was arrested in July 2013, but the Los Zetas have hardly quelled their vicious practices. The Los Zetas routinely make more money from illegal immigration than from narcotics smuggling, which means that the US policy surrounding those markets affects the cartel's business. In fact, there was an ex-director of ICE who said that if you're a run-of-the-mill illegal immigrant, your chances of getting deported are basically zero. And even if you do get marked for deportation, it can sometimes take up to 6 years to actually have you deported. I'm here in eastern Laredo, where a lot of the illegal immigration and human trafficking tends to happen. It's over on the western part that you have more of the large narcotic shipments. And you can tell by just looking around here that you have debris from people. You have clothing, you have shorts, and there's activity here almost every single night because they can come across the river and get up here, and then they can look over the hill for a scout, and if they see CBP, they can jump back in the river. No one crosses the border illegally without the help of the cartel. To them, it's just a market created by the fact that America has semi-permeable barriers. Now, what a lot of people don't know about Laredo is that the tunnel system goes deep into the city, and CBP can't chase illegals into the tunnel system. So once they're in there, they're gone. And we're gonna head up here and take a look at this tunnel. You'll see that there's a grate over the tunnel. This was only installed in the last couple years. This wasn't always like this. There's not actually weld marks or anything, which means that somebody hasn't successfully cut through this and gotten into this tunnel. And you certainly couldn't fit under there. But now let's head up the road here and take a look at what we got up here. You can hop right up, and one of the other tunnels is right here. And this is one that actually hasn't been sealed off, and you could get down there if you wanted to. So while Laredo has a treasure trove of locations for trafficking of all sorts, the CBP presence is much stronger than the next place we visited. In a town that shares over 16 miles of a border with Mexico, 5 miles of border protection isn't adequate. The wall begins right at the southern tip of the town, and where it ends is between a field and the Mexican desert. From there, it's only a half mile to the nearest road and just under 2 miles to Interstate 10, which runs from California to Florida. And immigration checkpoints are hardly much of a safeguard. Luckily, we managed to get permission from CBP to drive on their access road and traverse the full length of the wall. So we're out here now at the western edge of the Fort Hancock wall, and we were at Angie's Diner, the little local diner earlier, and we had a lot of people who talked to us, and they didn't want to be filmed, but they were telling us a lot of stories about how people just walk over, and it's gotten really bad just in the last couple years. How would you characterize the border situation down there?
Desperate. We have a culture here on the border that is unique. It's a beautiful culture. It's bicultural. We have a lot of families that are split in half by an international boundary. All my life, I've lived here on the border, so I've watched this evolve. Nowadays, the times have changed. There's very little law on that side. The cartels have taken over. As an adult, I don't go to that town anymore. That's how dangerous it is. Back in the days, we used to have a lot of people cross over that came to work. They would cross, and then some of them would go back. Some of them would send the money back to families. But everybody who came was searching for a better life, and they had a work ethic. Now there's a large majority of people that are coming that are different-minded. They demand when they get here. Demand that you feed them. They demand, and they don't come and offer to do something for what they're getting. They just demand it when they get here. And there's so many coming. Well, it's not uncommon to be driving down the road and see groups of people. And the Border Patrol will go to pick them up, and then that's when they ask for asylum. Last year, somebody was on my mother's porch all night long, and he had taken her patio furniture and made a bed out of it and slept on her patio. She called me in the morning and said, "There's somebody here." She felt sorry for him and made him a sandwich, and then told him, "You better leave," because I called my son. And so I'm hauling butt over there to get to her. When I get there, he's gone. At lunchtime that day, I go to my house. Somebody knocks on my door. I take a little time to put my boots on. When I get to the front door, there's nobody there. I think, how strange. So I walk out the front of my house, walk around the house. When I get to the back door, there's somebody opening my door, going in, breaking into my house. It's the same guy. I had him sit down and I fed him. I gave him pizza and an orange soda. And I had him sit there on my back porch waiting until the Border Patrol came and picked him up and took him away. And the first thing he said when they got there is, "I want asylum." You know, I'm not saying they shouldn't come in. They can come in, but come in properly. So to tell me that it's not a problem, it is a problem. You know, it is a very big problem. And when people make light of this issue, when you have caravans of people coming, then we have a problem. You know, nobody's bridging this cultural difference. And is it their fault? Is it our fault? Whose fault? Who cares whose fault it is? There's a cultural difference, and there's going to be a clash. And that clash is the root of the problem. The guy that was sitting right here, he's one of the EMTs that drive the ambulance. He asked a lady yesterday that he took to El Paso on an ambulance. He asked her, he said, "Excuse me, can I ask you a question?" She said, "Sure." He said, "How much did it cost you to get from Guatemala to here?" She told him $7,000 to get to Juarez. Another $200 from Juarez to get to Porvenir. $7,000 you can get your paperwork through.
Is there any time in particular that you've noticed like an uptick in people coming across?
Oh yeah, this year. You know, somebody is put out something in the media or something about, you know, the free ride or whatever, that they need to come up here. There was a steady 2 or 3 were in groups. Every now and then you'd have 20, 30 in groups, but you didn't have groups of 300. The cartels are helping these people get across in these big groups so that the Border Patrol is completely covered up doing paperwork. They're not doing their job, they're doing paperwork. And now the news media is reporting this checkpoint's closed, that checkpoint's closed. Where do we drive with our load of drugs? There's no checkpoint. This has a lot more to do than just immigration.
No, we live in Serra Blanca, outside of Serra Blanca, and we have people coming through all the time. By the time they get to our place, it's already too late to even try to catch them because they're already on their way. But they find them dead all the time because these immigrants come through. They hide during the day, and quite a few have been found dead. But they have water, they have food, they got everything, but the snakes got them.
During the entirety of our time at the diner, a total of maybe 15 people showed up. None of them wanted to be filmed, and only 2 would talk to anyone from the media with an audio recorder on. It turns out that the AP and a couple other major outlets showed up, took pictures of people that they weren't supposed to, cut up their words, and really gave the town a sour taste for the media as a whole. But I will say that the ones who talked to us gave us some remarkable stories. So we're standing here now at the start of the fence in Fort Hancock. This is at the southern tip. It extends for roughly 5 miles that way, and the nearest road is probably about only a half mile out that way. And you can see behind me here that there's actually a Jeep path from Mexico right through here. And sure, CBP is stationed around this area, but we just drove probably 2 miles of the border wall and we saw no CBP. And let me be clear, the issues with CBP presence does not rest on the agents themselves. It's primarily a lack of resources available to them. My hope is that this documentary draws attention to the border issues in Fort Hancock because the people in the town so rarely get a voice, and when they do, as I was saying, it's butchered by the media for their own agenda. Even those who refused to be interviewed made their thoughts clear by simply nodding or exclaiming during the recorded interviews. The consensus for a stronger border is unanimous in Fort Hancock, and the stories are the same for many residents. Notice though that there is actually a steel plate on the Mexican side, so if you're trying to climb the border wall, it can be tough, except for the fact that it ends right there. So if you do manage to get over though, you have quite the pit to deal with, because this kind of pit right here extends the entire length of the border wall that we've drove so far. But again, you see it ends right here. Now, the next place we visited is a nearby city where the usefulness of a wall is heavily debated. The city of El Paso, much like Laredo, has a violent crime rate that's rather low while being adjacent to the headquarters of a cartel. In El Paso's case, that would be the Juarez cartel. They're a fierce rival with the Sinaloa cartel, which controls all that's west of Juarez control. They engage in narcotic smuggling, kidnapping, human trafficking, and extortion. But cartels in general do not want to attract attention to border cities by bringing in massive amounts of crime that affect the locals. If they do that, then the government and the people will be inclined to do more to slow their operations, which would close certain routes into the US. The Rio Grande ceases being the border on the western outskirts of the city, so a steel-slatted wall and heavy CBP presence graces the area currently. And while the crime rate might not look all that out of the ordinary, what is being deemed a migrant crisis is still overwhelming the city's shelters, forcing them to be released onto the streets. In fact, one of the stories that motivated me to do this documentary in the first place was the fact that ICE is releasing thousands of migrants onto the streets of El Paso with a court date, and if they don't show up, then that's fine. They're now in America and their chances of being deported are nil. There was a congresswoman from El Paso named Veronica Escobar who said that it's a federal obligation and the federal government needs to step in and build some temporary housing facilities. So she wants the productive people in the country to be financially responsible for everyone who enters the US and wants asylum. That doesn't sound like freedom to me. She also said that the long-term solution is to send even more tax dollars to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, despite them already receiving $67 million, $31 million, and $46 million respectively in 2018 alone. All three of those countries were actually getting significantly more than that prior to 2018, and there wasn't anything substantial to show for it. In February of this year, President Trump made a claim that riled many people up.
The border city of El Paso, Texas, used to have extremely high rates of violent crime, one of the highest in the entire country, and considered one of our nation's most dangerous cities. Now, immediately upon its building, with a powerful barrier in place, El Paso is one of the safest cities in our country.
So while it's untrue that El Paso had one of the highest crime rates in the nation, it is true that crime was going down before the border wall construction. So you have to ask why crime was going down. It wasn't just spontaneous. In 1993, the crime rate began falling, and it coincided perfectly with Operation Hold the Line, which ran until 2001. It was an operation consisting of massively increased border presence, the repairing of holes in the current fence, and the intercepting of anyone attempting to enter the US illegally. It was a change in approach from the traditional find and deport method. It immediately affected the illegal apprehensions in El Paso and is supposed to have affected them elsewhere, as it's credited with 286,000 fewer aliens crossing in 1994 and 146,000 fewer crossings in 1996. Seeing the immediate success of Operation Hold the Line, there was an allocation of resources to the busiest corridors along the border, which saw a contiguous decrease of roughly 12,000 apprehensions per month across the entire US-Mexico border. Another point not to be lost here is that the violence in Ciudad Juarez was increasing at a tremendous rate, and it could be predicted when the border wall was approved back in 2006. How do they know that it was going to increase, you might ask? Well, in 2006, the Mexican government shifted their focus to destroying the cartels rather than stopping the trafficking, which was then left up to the US. The result of this shift in focus was deemed the Mexican drug war. This caused an increase in violence as the cartels battled for the ever-diminishing trafficking routes into the US. Ciudad Juarez is currently a hotspot for fighting between the Juarez cartel and the Sinaloa cartel, and the murder rate is still much lower than it was in 2010 during the peak of their violence. So, while the wall might not have led to a decrease in the crime rate in El Paso, it did help keep it from rising while violence was spiking across the border. But regardless of what's presented in this documentary, the border will continue to be a point of tension among people in El Paso. I got the shots that I wanted, and then we were on to the next city. Of course, all underground routes are torturous, but some of the deadliest paths into the US are in Arizona. Out of those willing to face the sweltering heat, open desert, and sparsely populated areas, many never survive to see the other side, and while there are cartel routes, they'll often use some vehicle such as a Humvee or a dirt bike. What this desolate climate has created is an even more concentrated hotspot in Nogales, Arizona, which is the border city that leads to Tucson and then on to Phoenix. The cartels slip through Nogales without disrupting much because they don't want to attract attention to the source. The sector is even called the Tucson sector, displaying how little of the disruptions to daily life, if any at all, stay in Nogales. Here, one of the characteristics that makes it particularly difficult to monitor for any law enforcement personnel is the fact that it's a city with the border intersecting the city. It's not just a city on the border. There's Nogales, Arizona, and then Nogales, Sonora in Mexico, and the Mexican side is substantially larger. This means that the city's underground tunnel system is a huge point of concern for smuggling because it's all connected. In Nogales, we had the opportunity to talk to the county sheriff, Tony Estrada, and he gave us some insight into the world that he faces. And while we might not agree on a few things, he certainly offered a firm perspective of the pull factors America sets in front of the cartels.
Obviously, I lived all my life here along the border. I've been in law enforcement going on 52 years here in Santa Cruz County in Nogales. So I got an opportunity to live in the past when Nogales was growing up on both sides of the border. When we had maybe 8,000 people in the city here, 40,000 people on the Mexican side. Now we got 300, 400,000 people on the Mexican side. When I was growing up, we didn't have the issues that we have today. It's like day and night. People could come over. There was no problem. People could get immigrated. It was a lot easier, a lot simpler, which is what we should be trying for right now. And we failed miserably on that. To the point that now it's more difficult, more expensive, and in most cases, if you want to come across illegally, more dangerous. You know, we're intertwined. We're like joined at the hips with the neighbors across the line. And like I mentioned to you, the only thing that separates us is that wall or that fence. And there was a time when we didn't even have that. And if we did have a fence, it was symbolic more than anything else. I mean, it wasn't to keep people out. What we're talking about now is completely the opposite. We're talking about building walls to separate and divide people and keep people from coming into the country, which I understand that people should come across legally, they should. But the stark reality is that people, the majority of people that are coming are poor, from extreme poverty, avoiding, gangs, corrupt government, everything else. So that is never going to stop. But in my opinion, we've mishandled the whole situation terribly. From past administration to the current administration, I think has done the worst job of trying to deal with illegal immigration. During the holidays, Mexican holidays, they would actually let people come across without any papers. And they'd probably go back or probably stay, we don't know. But it wasn't a big issue, it wasn't a big concern, it wasn't a crisis, it was not an emergency. I know for a fact that most of the drugs that are coming through, especially the hard drugs, are coming through the ports of entry. I know that happening every day. They're coming under well. We didn't have any of those issues. We didn't have the issues with illegal immigration until they started having an influx of people coming across. And probably some of the things that contributed to that, a peso devaluation, I think we had one of those. We had NAFTA that kicked in 1994. Prior to 1995, there were less than 100 Border Patrol agents, maybe 70 Border Patrol agents up to 1994. 1995, with all this activity coming through, they started sending more Border Patrol agents. They started putting a wall, an actual wall, between the ports of entry. But in 1995, with all of that activity coming on, Border Patrol agents started coming in. They put sensors, they put floodlights, and like I said, that wall, concrete wall or metal wall. The first drug tunnel was discovered from the Dennis Cancini, which is the main port of entry here, 2 blocks away at an old abandoned church was a drug tunnel. Why? Because the cartels were finding it more difficult to bring their drugs through the port because there was more security, or around the port because of the wall or the fence. So they started digging underneath. There is no buffer zone between us and Mexico. Nothing. I mean, we're back to back. Since then, since 1995, there have been over 100 drug tunnels. Last month, there were 3 drug tunnels that were discovered. One of them made it into the United States, 2 of them didn't, but there was no actual exit point. There's probably more being dug right now because there is no buffer zone. The dynamics of this particular community, this border community, this border county, is that we have 45,000 people in the whole county. And on the backyard, on the Mexican side, about 400,000 people. Think about the dynamics of a small American community in one of the most powerful, richest country in the world. And in your backyard, you have a third world country, which is 10 times bigger than you are. Okay? And you say, how do you deal with those dynamics? I mean, you must be overwhelmed, it must be chaotic, it must be dangerous. Let me tell you that as far as crime, April and last year was a bad year in Nogales and Santa Cruz County. There were 4 homicides. Prior to that, in the county, we had not had a homicide since November of 2011. And in the city of Nogales, since March of 2012. Last year was a bad year. It was unprecedented, and it wasn't necessarily associated with drug trafficking. It wasn't. I don't look at it as a crisis or an emergency. I look at it as another challenge and an opportunity. What the United States did years back, decades back, they took their eye off of Mexico. They said, it's a friendly little nation, you know, let's look for trouble all over the world. And they did. And they forgot Mexico, and look what happened with Mexico. It's a corridor for all the drugs and the people that are coming through. In 2010, Senate Bill 1070 was put into law. Okay, a senator by the last name of Pierce and the governor by the name of Brewer signed that first anti-immigration bill, in the first one in the whole United States, and then some other state wanted to model it, no? So every Mexican, including myself, if I were inland somewhere, would have a target on my back, because the question would be, are you legally here or not? They weren't looking at Asians, they weren't looking at anybody else, Europeans, they were looking at Mexicans for that bill. In about the 1970s or so, I don't know exactly when, the U.S. government said, you got them, you keep them. So all of a sudden, the taxpayers in Santa Cruz County started paying for all of these people that we were catching with drugs, and they were just carriers. I mean, they didn't make a difference to the cartels. We were filling the court calendars, we were filling the jails, and we were defending and prosecuting, giving medical, everything, to the point that it was costing, because it was a survey that was done, or a study that was done by a researcher out of the University of Arizona by the name of Tennant Salon. She has since retired. In 2000 and 2001, she did the first study in Santa Cruz County about the impact of illegal immigration and drugs on the taxpayers. It was $2 million a year. And let me tell you that of the 4 border counties, we were then and we are still the poorest. When Senate Bill 1070 came up, I was adamant about it. I was adamant because I was one of the very few that had any history that said, you know what the federal government wanted us to do? They wanted us to be immigration officers. We could not afford it. They would have broken the bank. We really don't not deal with, we don't have influx of people that are coming across. And the ones that do come, the Border Patrol handles. I've only got 38 commissioned officers, including myself. So the federal government, the arrests that they make and seizures that they make at the port, most cases they'll bring him here before they take him to Tucson for a federal court. Okay, so I'm holding some of those people temporarily. I'm holding some people that are immigration that have been sent 20, 30, 50, 60 days. They will bring him here, and then after they serve their time, they're deported. We do that. We're also holding people for Border Patrol. At night, they may bring us 30 people at 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, they'll pick them up and take them to Tucson. So, you know, just a temporary detention for these people. We're not in the business of housing and interacting or having contact with people that come across the border illegally. We may go days, maybe weeks, without encountering somebody that is in the county illegally. Border Patrol probably does it on a daily basis, but even their numbers are down. As a country, we may not want to admit it, we are responsible for the cartels. Why? Because we have 5% of the world's population consume over 50% of the world's drugs. As long as we have that demand, the cartels are going to be there. We created the cartels because of that appetite for drugs. And not only that, when it started getting in the 1990s, mid-90s, more difficult, more expensive, and more dangerous for people to come across, the cartels said, hey, this is another business opportunity for us. So now the cartels are in business of human smuggling. We have created that monster. Years back, I remember if we got a couple of ounces of meth, and sometimes they would meth and put it in the radiators and then dilute it. If we got a couple of ounces of meth, it was that scary because it was a new drug that was so potent and so dangerous. It was scary. Now we're getting hundreds of pounds of meth. You got people coming across the border in what we call cocktail of drugs. They come over with cocaine, heroin, meth, and fentanyl in one trip. You got young people that are coming across, body carriers, every day. People are getting caught at the border every day. If you're going to reduce drugs, and you're going to reduce people coming across the border, which is what they're doing through the ports, you're going to have to vet them better, okay? People come across with false documents, they make false claims, and they bring drugs across in cars, on foot, body, you name it. You don't have enough inspectors to check people. It takes forever. And the line coming across takes hours sometimes. It hurts business, it hurts the commerce, it hurts relationship. Now, if you were to close the border, as the president is claiming he wants to do, or threatening to do, it's going to be devastating to both sides. I'm optimistic. We won't never get back to where we were 40, 50, 60 years ago. Never will. But I think things should get better at some point. But it won't get better until they address the problems from where the source is. If they don't do that, it's going to continue to come. And people are not going to be coming through the border, through the wall, okay? Let's say they don't. Let's say they're going to come by land, by sea, and by air. And they're going to come to Canada.
How do you perceive the effect that the cartels, specifically like the Sinaloa cartel, might have, or what they might use a city like Nogales for?
Well, just a transit point. That's all we are, because the drugs don't stay here. The demand is not here. It's in Tucson and inland. The cartels avoid us. They avoid confrontation with us because it draws more attention, more resources. They want their product to get to the market. Their markets are Tucson and Phoenix and vice versa. It doesn't stay here. Occasionally, we run into a stash house, maybe waiting to see what's happening at the checkpoint. I know that there are connections, there are ties, there are relationships with the cartels or with the groups, especially with the Sinaloa cartel, which is the one that dominates this area. I'm pretty sure there are people across the line. There are facilitators, there are cells, people that, there's no question about it. They got people all the way through. And do they have an impact on us, a direct impact? No. I mean, look, we're not dodging bullets. We're not being threatened by them. It may be happening on the other side. You got a third world country over there. You got slums over there. You got people using drugs, and probably getting involved in that. So the cartels do have an influence, an impact, I'm sure, on law enforcement over there. Because over there, if you don't cooperate, you don't exist. Years back, I used to hear that the Jamaican gangs were the most ruthless and vicious gangs in the world. The cartels, in my opinion, are the worst. They're the worst. They have no empathy. They don't care. They don't care. It's all business. When you think about illegal immigration and you think about the drug problem that we have in this country, illegal immigration pales. It pales compared to the drug problem that we have in this country. Why? Because you can't do much about the drug problem. It's getting worse. When I got started, I could hear that it was going to take 3 generations to wean people out of drugs. It's worse. It is worse than it was, much worse. Okay? So we got a real problem with drugs, number one. And illegal immigration, you can solve it. You can address it. Some common sense, you apply it, you can work something out. You don't have to threaten people. So when anybody says we have a crisis with illegal immigration, we have an emergency with illegal immigration, I say we have an emergency and a crisis in the drug problem that we have in this country. And the other crisis and emergency that we have is in Washington. Here's the guy that caught with 57 pounds of meth, $2.5 million worth of drugs on the Mexican side, 2,900 pounds of marijuana, and 300 pounds of meth on the Mexican side, trying to make it over here. Record fentanyl seizure, more than 250 pounds of fentanyl, nearly 400 pounds of meth at the port of entry up there.
One of the most resounding points that the sheriff made was that as long as the willingness to condemn yourself to a life of addiction exists in a large percentage of the population, the cartels will continue to find ways to operate. It was shocking to hear that they've confiscated over 250 pounds of fentanyl in one drug bust. That's enough to kill roughly 57 million people. The root of the vacuum that the cartels are filling exists within the American population. Many will characterize addiction as the issue, when in reality there's a reason for the addiction. I personally think it's due to a lack of moral direction, so many slip into hedonism or nihilism, but regardless, it's something interesting that the sheriff gave me to think about. If addiction to what the cartel is selling disappeared, there would be no more cartel power. Shortly after my conversation with the sheriff, we were back on the road heading west to our final stop. The southern edge of California has some beautiful country, mountains, cacti, and amazing weather. While visiting Southwest California, we decided to make the most of our time and first visit the wall between San Diego and Tijuana. To my surprise, there was almost nobody in the parking lot and even less people on the beach. Those that were there were primarily riding horses, but regardless, the border security is heavy. Come to find out that the water is contaminated with sewage, so people aren't supposed to swim, and the beach is really more of a point of interest for this documentary as opposed to a tourist destination. In 2014, San Diego was estimated to have 170,000 illegal immigrants, and the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim area, which is between 100 and 120 miles north of San Diego, was estimated to have 1 million. On the border wall, people in Tijuana had previously stolen razor wire from it to use for their own homes because it works so well. This particular sector of the border continues to be a hotspot for migrant caravans and Tijuana cartel operations. But as I said, Border Patrol was carefully watching over the area. This was just a detour from our meeting with a man who lives on the border and has stared the cartel down on more than one occasion.
Nice to meet you.
Bob Maupin is a well-trained and well-armed man who lives on the border just east of San Diego. One of the unique aspects of Bob's property is the wall that he built himself after finding the US government's wall to be inadequate. Shortly after arriving, we were already heading to his truck to go see it. The traffic that comes through his property was more comprehensible when he informed me that the people across the road from him are smugglers and thieves. It's why he has cameras and sensors all over his property. He drove me right up to the fence that he built, and unfortunately it was in need of repairing. But then he asked if I had heard of El Chapo Guzman.
Okay, you see that big place way off there to the left? That's El Hongo. That is the maximum security prison that he escaped from. And the army was just here and put all that concertina wire up on top of that. That's that landing mat that they got stored here.
Bob learned to ride horseback riding with Department of Agriculture agents along the border. They were looking for anything with a split hoof or a hoof and mouth disease. Some of the cartels that come through his property include the Arellano Felix cartel, also known as the Tijuana cartel, the Sinaloa cartel, the Muslim Brotherhood, and MS-13.
A friend of mine who was a gunny in the Corps, he called me up and he says, I want to make you a deal. And I said, yeah. He says, there's 5 guys who just got out of the Corps and the VA is trying to convince them that they're PTSD. They're not. But under Obama, if they're PTSD, then they have to turn in their weapons. They cannot own a firearm. So Obama was deathly afraid of anybody that was in the military. So that was one way of trying to disarm all of them. So he said, if these guys can come out, camp on your place, you know, we'll come out and camp and let them do stuff, use your rifle range, and anything you need done around the ranch, hey, we'll do it for you. And now there's over 50 of them from all over Southern California.
During Operation Gatekeeper, migrants were running into San Diego and actually running up the wrong way on the freeways, so they moved a lot of agents to the area, but they weren't paying much attention to what was going on farther east. So Bob used to pick up anywhere from 20 to 100 illegal migrants per night. Operation Gatekeeper was similar to Operation Hold the Line that I mentioned earlier in El Paso. Seeing as Bob's property is east of San Diego, it only makes sense that traffic was diverted to his area when routes were cut off further west. After driving around with Bob, we went into his house and got the chance to have a discussion with him about some of his experiences on the property.
There was a building down in Mexico that had blue windows, for what reason I don't know. And every now and then they'd fly the Mexican flag, and there were all kinds of brand new vehicles around there, and there were people walking the perimeter with military style weapons. And you may, with government permission, you may own a .22 or you may own a shotgun. And we were hearing automatic weapon fire down there a lot. Anyway, one day my wife and I are out here before the old barn collapsed, and the breeze is always from the southwest, and we smelled something that smelled like a doctor's office. Well, it finally dawned on us, ether. So I called a friend of mine who had been an undercover narcotics agent and told him about it, and he said, my God, if you can smell it at your house, they're making meth by the boatload. So he says, stay by your telephone, I'm going to have a DEA guy call you. So the DEA called out of Los Angeles, and we got together on a Thomas Brothers map, showed him where I was and showed him where the meth lab was. And I said, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going to give it to my counterparts in Mexico and they'll go close it down. The following weekend, my daughter decides to go shooting down there where the shooting range is. And my son calls up and he says, I want to come up and do some target practice. Okay. I go down there because my daughter never stops shooting until Dad runs out of ammo. Anyway, we go down there and we're surrounded by the Mexican army. And they disarmed us. And we conned them into coming up to the house. My daughter, we came through the brush, and I told my daughter when we got around by the old corral to head for the house. Regardless of what happens back here, you head to the house and call the Border Patrol. So she did. And we were more or less held hostage for 4 hours, and then the Border Patrol showed up and arrested them. And that was the start of our fun out here.
This is a picture that Bob took of a Mexican officer on his property. What you can't see is the gun in his hand. And this is when they tried to burn him out, but it didn't jump the fence.
The cartels used to stage down south, cut the barbed wire fence and drive through with 4 or 5 truckloads of drugs at a time.
This M was cut in his fence as a warning from MS-13, but with how well armed Bob is, he was hardly concerned.
And so one day they were staging down there, and the Border Patrol was here, and some of the guys that the Border Patrol called Maupin's Marauders were here with me, and they all went down towards the border, and I sat in that old green pickup truck with a Browning 1919 and a box of belted armor-piercing ammunition down here in the middle of the road. We had an east wind that day, and a new Border Patrol agent came down from the west, and they got him on the radio and said, "Get off the road, turn into Maupin's Gate, and go up to the house, and we'll let you know what's going on." So he comes in the big gate where we went down there, the big black gate. He came in there, drove up the road, and there's a spotter by this tower just south of my house. He's got a radio and he's got binoculars. And this agent saw him, and of course he didn't hear the car because the wind is blowing into the guy's face and the car's behind him. So he goes up and grabs the guy and got on the radio and said, "Hey, I got the spotter." They said, "Well, you just killed the deal because without the spotter, they're not coming across." So he comes down the road where we went down and went south. He was coming north, came around, and pulls up alongside me, and he says, "What on earth are you doing?" And I said, "Well, when the trucks come up, I'm going to take the engines out, and I'm going to go through the windshields, and I'm going to kill every one of them guys. They're no longer going to come through my property with drugs, period." And this little Mexican spotter was up against the window, and his eyes were like, the deer in the headlights. They all understand English. So they processed him back into Mexico, and about 2 weeks later, some guys came over to the house, and they were plainclothes, Border Patrol, intel, and said, "Watch your back, they put a $20,000 bounty on you." Now, I had ordered an FNFAL, which looks like those G3s, only it's a semi-automatic, those are actually assault weapons, they're machine guns. They've got semi and full automatic fire. I figured if it looked like theirs, they'd think I had something bad. Well, the first Bush had just signed the assault weapon ban. Now, an assault weapon is actually a machine gun. An AR-15 and AR-10 are not assault weapons because they don't fire full automatic. The communists in our government want to ban them, so they call them assault weapons. Anyway, so the company I had ordered this from, I kept bugging them. I had a gun store in Alpine at the time, and they said, "We can't get the guns," because even though we had bought them, paid for them prior to the enactment of this law, Customs is holding them and won't let us have it, so we're having to sue the government to get them. This may take a long time. So how about we send you another rifle that shoots .308, the same thing? Okay, so they sent me a match grade M14, which the military has used for a long time. And then one day I was walking down, going for a walk, and I walked down there towards the border. That was before my fence and before the steel fence. But after they put the bounty on me, and a couple of guys were walking up, they thought the ag fence was the border. The border was 60 feet south, on the south end of the Roosevelt easement, because Theodore Roosevelt, when he was president, took 60 feet off everybody's property from Brownsville to the Pacific Ocean. The Department of Agriculture put a fence up 60 feet in. Then in the treaty, the Mexicans were going to put a fence up on the border. They haven't done it yet. It's only been 100 years, so, you know. There was a guy with a rifle and the guy with a gallon jug of water walking up there, and my dogs were run down there barking at him. They spotted the dogs, and then the guy with the water bottle spotted me, and the guy takes a rifle down. He missed me by about 2 feet. So I pulled my M14 out from behind me and blew the water bottle out of the kid's hand. And my first round's always a hollow point. So when that hits a bottle of water, it just explodes. And I've not been shot at from Mexico since. I've had several people with guns that I've encountered, and they know what I look like. So they'd be sitting there with a rifle, and then they go, oh, and turn around and walk off. But like I said, it's been interesting living here.
After talking with Bob, we got back on the road, headed on the final stretch back to Texas so I could fly home. Over the past decade, there was a considerable shift in where the majority of apprehensions were taking place. It used to be the Tucson sector, of which Nogales is part of, but it shifted to the Rio Grande Valley sector, which is where McAllen, Texas is located, which, again, is said to have an extraordinarily low crime rate compared to what you might expect. And while statistics will get you pretty far, there are still some issues with them. One is that there's really no way to know what or who is coming across the border, so any smuggling statistics will be understating the situation. It's said that most narcotics come in through ports of entry, and while that seems believable, they have no idea what enters under their noses or even outside of the ports of entry. There's the open Rio Grande in Laredo, mountains and a short fence in Fort Hancock, a suitable wall with CBP presence in El Paso, a wall with razor wire that's subverted by tunnels in Nogales, a tall wall with razor wire on the San Diego-Tijuana border, and east of that there's a solid border wall with razor wire on top. So while no wall will stop everyone, that isn't the objective. As I mentioned earlier, we talked to a CBP officer at a border checkpoint north of Del Rio who didn't want to be filmed, but he told us that the intended purpose of the wall is to create a choke point so CBP resources can be put to more efficient uses. As far as the cartels are concerned, I think that between the testimony in Fort Hancock, the explanation from Bob Maupin, and the strength of U.S. markets that the sheriff made clear, it's safe to say that the cartels aren't going anywhere anytime soon. That's why it's worth noting that U.S. Representative Chip Roy from Texas and Dr. Mark Green from Tennessee drafted a letter to send to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo urging him to designate certain factions of certain cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. They specifically named the Los Metros faction of the Gulf Cartel, the Cartel del Noreste faction of the Los Zetas, and the Jalisco Nueva Generacion offshoot of the Sinaloa. This would allow the U.S. to go after those who aid the cartels, such as banks, companies, politicians, lawyers, because providing material support to a foreign terrorist organization is a pretty serious crime. In 2004, a man by the name of Rocky Juarez flipped to the DEA about how 4 years earlier he had been instructed to pay off the Nuevo Laredo police because they were on the cartel's payroll. And if you look from 1999 through the end of 2010, the governorship of Tamaulipas was controlled by surrogates of the Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, which essentially means that they accepted money to allow the cartels to continue to operate. Whenever we talk about the border though, as long as we're aiming for the same end goal, we can have a conversation about this. I think that a reasonable place to stand is to want society to absorb the best aspects of foreign input while maximally protecting against the negative aspects. If you deny either the good or the bad, there's unfortunately very little room for compromise. But if you accept that, then the whole of this documentary has led me to see the necessity in a strong border and for people to be able to enter legally. So the current immigration system does have to be reformed, but of course it's not enough to simply leave it at that, because that doesn't explain much of anything. So while legal entry is a great asset, allowing markets to set what they demand and when they demand it will set the most beneficial immigration levels. Then you're getting people with a work ethic who can start building a life right away, as opposed to staying in government subsidized housing and then being released onto the streets. Some are complaining that there aren't enough facilities to hold asylum seekers, but that's because the bar for claiming asylum is remarkably low. So droves of people from countries worse than America are fleeing here for the promised handouts. Yes, some are coming to work, but as we heard in Fort Hancock and elsewhere, the number of people just demanding something for nothing is rising dramatically. It's been shown time and time again that handouts are no solution. The problem with poor countries has never been the fact that they don't have enough money. That's a symptom of a deeper illness, and giving them handouts is reinforcing the very actions that allowed the destructive behaviors to fester. In preparation for this specific section of the documentary, I studied the root causes of why people are coming to America from as many different angles as possible, and I singled out as many factors as I could. When looking at immigration, both legal and illegal, there are factors that the immigrants had to consider that ended with them moving countries. If it's something that pushed them out of a country, such as war, poverty, crime, then it's called a push factor. If it incentivized them to go to a country for an opportunity to do what they see as bettering their life, whether it's handouts or work opportunities, then it's called a pull factor. Currently, America has an exorbitant amount of destructive pull factors that form the structure of the welfare state. Without counteracting immigration standards, this leads to a lower quality of immigrant on average. And when talking about illegal immigration, there's no ability to set standards anyway. The pull factors from the welfare state work to create a dependent and largely permanent underclass, and unfortunately it incentivizes the behavior that landed people in need of welfare to begin with. That's why children of parents on welfare are, on average, more likely to be on welfare themselves. But the same type of issue is at work with foreign aid. A country that gets a taste of foreign aid will alter their country to accommodate the change. And what I mean by this is that Western businesses will swoop in to snag the aid for work that never gets done, as happened in Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Or the money will be funneled to dictators that are oppressing the people in the first place. Or even when the people get it, it begins to make them dependent on the aid because it wrecks their already dilapidated economies by supplying a necessity at a price that no one can compete with. A very fundamental issue that many people can't seem to grapple with is how wealth is not a zero-sum game. If it were, then throughout all of human history, wealth would have simply been passed around, and it wasn't. It was created. So then the questions arise of how it's created and what other factors affect wealth creation that could be in play in these immigrants' countries of origin. Clearly, weighing out the positives and negatives, they're incentivized to come here, and while the welfare state serves as a destructive pull factor, the opportunity to work is a fantastic and helpful pull factor. So you can't just say that we need to eliminate the pull factors. Both sides need to be examined. The fundamentals of wealth creation begin with voluntary transactions where both parties feel as if they're better off. And while this doesn't create wealth, it serves to keep the wealth creation process sustainable by allowing resources to be properly allocated through prices that reflect the supply and demand of a given good or service. The way that wealth is then created is when people decide to save their wealth, allowing markets to restructure how they allocate resources, and those resources can then be put to more productive ends, again, highlighting the importance of prices with no government interference. Put simply, people need to produce more than they consume. This allows businesses to invest in capital goods and processes that serve to make laborers more productive per capita rather than simply producing and consuming at the same rate. This also explains how technology came about rather than using technology or knowledge as the fundamental explanation for why we have more wealth. So in a country with no oppressive government and no market disruption, this is the most solid theory for how wealth is created. However, foreign aid is something that I already mentioned, and it's a massive disruption for the markets in the countries that it's sent to. According to a former World Bank economist, William Easterly, over the course of a half century, there were $2.3 trillion allocated to save the developing world from poverty. Because the people in these countries don't get to speak to the media often, if at all, there's less incentive for the World Bank and the IMF and certain charities to really deliver. But what they do want to do is to keep making the headlines for donating the most money. So how do we actually help these countries? Well, it's not simple or easy, because the governments of these countries would need to roll back regulations, allow more free market trade, work to extinguish coercion, specifically that the cartels are using, government included, and to slowly adjust the culture to where people don't feel as if they have to get something by taking it from someone else. And while this alone might be enough of a barrier to forever hold some countries down because it would include the governments relinquishing large amounts of power, what the first world can do is stop funding these tyrants by giving them aid money and subsidizing the mistreatment of their own citizens with pallet loads of food, shoes, clothing. And it sounds harsh, but the root of that harshness rests in their own government, not in a lack of other countries caring about poor people. So what can America, Europe, Canada, Western culture in general do right now? You can secure your border so you know who's coming in and out. You can keep the promise to your citizens that you will protect them first. You can also eliminate the welfare state. Then, as I said before, allow immigration rates to be decided by business and industry so that there isn't an inherent surplus or shortage of immigrants. Without handouts, the two main pull factors left to a country are work opportunities and safety. Work opportunities are helpful to a country. Providing shelter, while it might be done with a good heart, is not. This means that the government has no right to lay this burden at the feet of the producers in a given country by just allowing in masses of people. While the government might be involved in the vetting process, it should rest solely on charities to decide how many people they can accept, how they'll house them, how they'll feed them, and how they'll be transported when it's time for them to either leave or build a productive life here through working and contributing. And let me be clear, these solutions that I'm offering aren't a be-all, end-all. There is a lot of nuance to these issues, and truthfully, I don't see any country radically changing because, as Machiavelli said, the reformer has enemies in those who profit from the old order, and those who would profit from the new order are only lukewarm because mankind doesn't truly believe in anything until they experience it. But this is a far more in-depth discussion on this topic than anyone with an agenda just trying to appeal to the masses would ever dare have. I'm trying to give you the tools to at least begin to examine this situation so you can cut through the clickbait headlines and the bleeding heart sob stories, because honest journalism shouldn't be a contradiction.